I'm going to keep the introduction somewhat brief for two reasons. The first one being our next speaker arrived, flew in from the permanent forum at the United Nations in New York, arrived at 10:30. He is leaving to return there at 1:30 this afternoon. So this truly is a real testament to this conference and this session and this gathering that he would undertake that journey simply to be out here in this territory for 3 hours. I asked him how to introduce him, and in a typically humble way, he said, just say Dr. Lawyer Chief and stop. I will say Dr. Lawyer Chief, inductee into 7 Sports Hall of Fame, still holder of the Canadian record in breaststroke at 50 meters, member of Parliament for a number of years, member of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission currently, and truly one of the groundbreaking and path-breaking leaders on all of the topics we've been discussing. So, Chief Littlechild, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and good afternoon to all of you. I bring you greetings from my peoples, the Cree, and just acknowledge the traditional owners and keepers of these territories. Thank you for inviting me and welcoming me into your territory. It's a great honor to be here with you this afternoon, and also want to acknowledge, of course, our elders, the chiefs who are here, all of the other leaders who are present, and all of you distinguished delegates. I want to tell you 2 stories. Actually, 3 stories. How I got to be here, thanks to Chief White for inviting me at a meeting we were at together just a couple of weeks ago in Ottawa. When I went to law school, I really did not want to study international law. I thought, why would I study international law? I would never use it. And also, I wanted to actually stay with hockey. That's why I went to law school. And so when I got to law school, there were 3 First Nations or Indigenous lawyers in Canada, 3. And there were 5 law students in Canada when I started law school. And when I went to law school, I quickly discovered there were not only very, very few Aboriginal students studying law, but there was no such thing as native law being taught in school or native studies classes, indeed faculties now. So I thought, well, for one of my options, they said I could write about anything, research anything of choice. So my first thought was I would study and do a paper on hockey violence, which I did. But then I think probably couldn't get away from it, but I started thinking about Indian law. And I asked myself, I wonder how many cases have been decided in courts in Canada on Indian law. And at the time, I actually counted them. There were 59. I thought, well, there's probably 59 a month or a year now for sure across the country. But back then, there were relatively few. And I wanted to study actually the impact of Section 88 of the Indian Act. So I started reading all these cases. And the very, very first case that came up in my research was White and Bob. That was the very, very first case that came to my attention. So it's a real honor for me to be here today. And secondly, I was sharing with the chief, you know, it's hard for you British Columbians to brag about yourself, but I'm here to brag about you a little bit. And I say that because when you look at the development of participation at the international level by Indigenous peoples, it actually started here. If you remember the late Chief Manuel, when he was president of the World Council of Indigenous Peoples, the very first World Summit was actually held in Vancouver. And then when you look at the series of events that have happened after that, right until last Monday at the United Nations, when Chief Ed John was selected as chairperson for the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. So you've got this history of contribution from British Columbia, not only great chiefs and leaders, but great cases in the courts, all the way to the international level. I share that also because usually when you look at the history of Indigenous development internationally, it starts in 1923. In 1923, when Chief Descahe from the Six Nations went to Geneva to try and get an audience at the League of Nations, what was then called the League of Nations, now of course the United Nations. And if you know that history, you'll know that he couldn't get an entry into the meeting. Luckily, the city council of the city of Geneva gave him an audience, and he was able to meet with the council and discuss Indigenous issues with them. 2 years later, in 1925, a spiritual leader from the Maori people, Ratani, went to the League of Nations. He too couldn't get an audience. So from 1923 to 25, there was an attempt of two chiefs and leaders to bring the issue of Indigenous concerns to the international arena. Then there was a long period of silence, no voice, till 1977. But the sad part of that history is that actually before that, the British Columbia chiefs were raising the issue of the Douglas Treaty internationally. In fact, I think in 1909 was the first time they raised the issue internationally. So you see, you've got a whole history of contribution that started here and brought it to the world stage, to where we are today, to last week to have one of your own selected as a leader at the United Nations. So congratulations to all of you. I say that I was actually having quite a lot of fun playing baseball and hockey, and all of a sudden one day I got a call in 1977 from an office in Lethbridge, and they said, Willie, there's going to be a meeting in Sweden, in Kiruna, Sweden, and they're looking for a chairperson, someone to do the chair of the World Conference on the issue of the ILO Convention 107. And she said, well, we'll call you in a couple of weeks to think about it. So they did. And I said, yeah, I'd sure love to go to Sweden, but I don't know about this chairman thing. And by the way, what is Convention 107? He said, don't worry, we'll fax it to you. So they did. Well, little did I know that was going to be a very big turn in my life, from wanting to be a lawyer just because of hockey to one where I didn't want to study international law, to be plucked into a meeting in Sweden in 1977 on the International Labor Organization, the only international law at the time regarding Indigenous peoples, the only actually legally binding international law at the time. So I met with the elders, and the elders after ceremony said to me, you know, this was in 1974, 75. We're very, very concerned here over the years of how willfully our treaties are being violated almost on a daily basis, they said. And because our agreement is with Her Majesty, the Queen, in the right of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, we think we have to go internationally. So you are going to go internationally to argue for our case. And I remember actually going before that to the elders, and I said, you know, I'm thinking of going to law school because I want to stay in hockey. They said to me, I just kind of want your advice, elders. Should I go to law school? They said to me, well, we'll ask you one question. No, I'm asking no, we'll ask you one question. They said, do you think you can defend treaty rights with a hangover? I said, no, I'm talking about law school and hockey. No, we will ask you one question again, they said. Do you think you can defend treaty rights on a hangover? And I said, no. Okay, then, well, you have to go to the bush for 4 days and 4 nights and fast. There, you will get your answer. So I did that, thankfully. And it was really through the wisdom of our elders that I ended up there, and thankfully to where I am today. I still live on a reserve. I've been to the United Nations now for 39 years, member of parliament, played international hockey, Supreme Court of Canada. So it was thankfully with the elders' question that really put me on a serious track. So the United Nations, I know someone said earlier that it's toothless, but you know what? It's up to us to put teeth into the United Nations so it can be strong. And I'll show you over the years where there is some teeth that have been put into the UN. This past week, there's a very important debate going on at the UN right now on the doctrine of discovery and the role it has played in our lives, even today. One of the elders a couple of weeks ago said to me, you know this, you're talking about this reconciliation, he says, he's got his finger on a table. Reconciliation, you got to go way back here to 1492, he said. And once you've got 1492, you have to go back further, and then you'll start dealing properly with doctrine of discovery, reconciliation, and the residential school legacies in that way. Similarly, the elders, after I came back from the bush, said to me, we're going to give you 4 instructions on which you will go to the international arena. Kikpaktingosoen, in my language, means inherent. They said to me, what we're talking about here are inherent rights. Uyutamasoen, they said, self-determination. Paminsoen, self-government. Tepemoen, consent. Esenstohtamak, the way we understand it. You can never, ever step back from those 4 instructions, they told me. Self-determination, self-government as we understand it, Cree government, the principle of consent are all inherent rights. And these are elders, they didn't go to law school, but that's the instructions that they gave me. So we've tried in a good way to seek and put reality into their dreams. So in 1977, after chairing the meeting on the convention, I was told to go to Geneva. They said, well, since you chaired the meeting, now you go to Geneva, and we want you to get the ILO convention amended. No easy. Well, anyway, so I did go to Geneva, and I met with the ILO. We did get the convention amended. It's now called ILO Convention 169. But during that discussion, we were told, this is the wrong place to bring about a discussion on self-determination. You need to go to the United Nations to discuss that. So we went to the United Nations in 1977. And a few years ago, we had a reunion, actually, of that first meeting, well, actually, the third meeting now in proper sequence, historically, at the UN. And 13 of us came back from that 1977 assembly of over 150 people from around the world. 1982, the UN decides to create a working group on indigenous populations. They called it at the UN, with 2 mandates. One was to establish a set of standards, which are now called the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The other one was to review developments as they happen. But concurrently, there was a case being discussed, and I heard Louise Mandel was here. She's one of the legal warriors that was involved with. I remember her paper that she did on consent, the importance of that concept, which is now a right to free, prior, and informed consent. And it's also a treaty principle. It's an international law treaty principle. There was a case going on in London because if you remember, Canada was going to patriate its constitution. And we went to London to challenge Canada's decision to bring back the constitution. We fought in court, in the London British courts, in front of Lord Denning. The lawyers will know that world-famous Lord Denning. This was not only the last case from Canada to go to the British courts, but it was one of his last cases that he sat as a judge, Lord Denning. So the elders said, you're going to go there now. Don't mess up. This is a serious case. Okay, again, elders, they... So I'm in London. I woke up in the morning and I thought, now, I have to go get a lawyer, the best lawyer, they told me in London. Go get the best lawyer. This is an important case. We're battling Canada on patriation. They cannot bring that constitution back unless there's treaty rights protected in the constitution. So I went down the yellow pages and I found this number and I phoned. This lady said, yes, may I help you? That's not quite the way she said, accent. Just imagine there's a British accent at the end of it. May I help you? And I said, yes, I'd like to make an appointment. I'll meet one of your senior lawyers because I want to discuss a case with him or her. She said, okay, actually we can come in at 9 o'clock in the morning if you're ready. I said, I'll be there. So I go to this lorry, taxi, went to this law firm address, and I had seen the sign at the door that had said Oppenheimer and Company. So I thought, well, that's a pretty serious looking, big, large letters, Oppenheimer. So I went in there and she said, yes, may I help you? Yes, I'm here to see Mr. Oppenheimer. Because, it must be the senior lawyer, right? I'm here to see Mr. Oppenheimer. And she said, who? Well, it must be your senior partner. He's on the logo up front of the sign, Mr. Oppenheimer. Are you sure? She said, yes, I am. A real serious case from Canada here. Well, sir, I hate to tell you this, but Mr. Oppenheimer, he's been dead for over 200 years. See, in England, they keep the name of the person who started the law firm. So there we were. We're going to fight Canada in England. But at the same time as this was happening, of course, there's the ILO being amended. The declaration is being drafted, and this court case is happening. But in 1986, the UN decided they're not going to have a meeting on the declaration. So we thought that's a very serious challenge to the work we're doing. So we went ahead anyway. We rented a room. We went ahead with the meeting and consolidated all the versions of the declaration we had seen and reviewed to that point and presented them to the UN. Well, they came back, actually, and rejected all of them. They said, no, we're going to start from scratch, and we're going to go. So some 23 years later, Article 36 got adopted. Article 36 is the article on treaties. I co-chaired that article with Canada. And I mention that because all these years we worked on the article on treaties, and I co-chaired it with Canada. And on the day that they voted, you all know what they did. They voted against it. So were they just fooling the UN, all the states in the world, that they were serious about this treaty issue? Because they were there, right next to me, co-chairing the meetings at the UN, drafting Article 37. But as you know, later on, they did change their position. But at the meetings, I remember we couldn't get two things agreed on. One was that the treaties should be looked at from the original spirit and intent, and also as understood by Indigenous peoples. I remember one government member actually getting up and saying, you know what, Mr. Chairman, we like that phrase, original spirit and intent. And I thought, wow, I got some support here. And he said, well, the reason we like it actually is because our intent was to steal your land. I said, oh, well, maybe we better not have that wording in there. So I struck it off. But it was the elders who really wanted that phrase in there because of its importance. But you know, at the debates, when the article was adopted, there was only one state that actually referred to article on treaty, and that was the United States. So really, I think we need to look at that article and build on its strength. There's unanimous consent on that article on treaties, which in my view includes the Douglas Treaty. And what it calls for is states to honor and respect the treaty. So later on I thought, well, did Canada vote against it because they didn't want to honor and respect the treaty? I didn't ask them that, I was just thinking that to myself. So with the persistent advocacy for actually 28 years now, we have international recognition of treaties. When I asked the elders, what is your dream and what is your goal? What is it that you want out of this instruction to go internationally? They said to me, all we want is recognition, respect, and justice. That's all we want. Recognition, respect, and justice. So I came back from the UN feeling really disheartened by what went on. But the good news is, we know that we put our best effort forward. In 1992, the Americas decided they're going to commemorate 500 years anniversary of Columbus discovering the Americas. So the Indigenous people said, hey, wait a minute now. You can celebrate. We don't have anything to celebrate. But you might want to commemorate it. That would be one thing. So they looked at each other apparently in the room. They said, what are we going to do? Well, first of all, the International Year got postponed for 1 year because there was such a loud outcry against the initiative. So in their wisdom, they decided, well, let's create a declaration, an OAS Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. That'll be our contribution. We said to them, don't do that without our participation. In fact, I wrote a letter to the OAS to that effect. But they went ahead anyway. They started writing a declaration. So in 1995, we gathered in Denver, and we sat down and we said, this will be the OAS Declaration. And we wrote it out, and we presented it to the OAS. They call it a Denver text for reference. But sometimes you got to be careful what you say and do, I guess. So they said, all right, you think you're so smart, you and 4 others, you're going to go into a room and you're going to go through all these 26 countries, what they say about treaties, and then come out with an article on treaties. Well, I was the only one. I was one out of the 5, and I was battling these 4 state members on an article on treaties. But the good news is that just a few short weeks ago, the Organization of American States agreed on April 20th on an article on treaties that says states shall honor and respect treaties that they've made with Indigenous peoples and their successors. And states shall take into account the true spirit and intent of treaty in good faith and as Indigenous peoples understand them. There was actually 17 years of work just on one article to get the original elders' dream and goal into international law. So now, after 39 years when we started it, we have the original dream of the elders when they said to us, Kikpaktin gosuin, oyotamason, eisen stotamah kiano, ete pemoyak. It's in there. And when courts from now on look at what the treaty means, they cannot just look in a black and white letter of the page. They have to take into account how we understand them. How do we understand them? They're in our songs, our treaty songs. They're in our ceremonies. They're in our oral testimony. Courts cannot ignore that anymore. And that's all the elders wanted when we started. So that then you'll have a full and more meaningful understanding of treaty. And I've said all along that treaties are not a problem. Treaties are a solution. Treaties are a solution, and we need to look at them from a partnership perspective. Because in my work now, when I go on these residential school hearings all across Canada, almost 3,000 witnesses now in 2.5 years, the challenge of reconciliation comes up. Well, I've been saying from day one that the United Nations Declaration is actually a framework for reconciliation, and the treaty partnership is a solution that helps us interpreting that declaration. So now that we have the international law in place, the next challenge, of course, is implementation. And I want to thank you, all of you, for being here, because implementation is going to take both of us as treaty partners. I sometimes tell a story about the railway track, and just looking at some of the faces in the audience, and even in the dark, I can tell some of you have been on a railway track trying to walk on a rail. You know, you can walk on a rail, you try, and pretty soon you'll fall off. You get back on and you try to walk some more. But you all know that if your partner walks the other rail and you hold hands together, you can walk for miles on that railway track because you support each other when the other one is going to fall off. That's how the arrangement ought to be with respect to treaty. And that's why I say it's going to take both of us to advance the Douglas Treaty. It's going to take both of us to advance the UN Declaration. It's going to take both of us to advance reconciliation. And they're all linked together, in my view. So far, last week, when the Deputy Secretary General opened the meeting of the Permanent Forum, not last week, actually, just on Monday, she said something quite interesting about the UN Permanent Forum. She said, for 11 years, it's been about uniting different voices and different languages in one single demand: recognizing, respecting, and promoting Indigenous peoples' rights. That really sounded like my elders' original instructions. So we're there, almost, because at the very first session of the Permanent Forum, the Secretary General of the United Nations came and spoke to us, and he said, I want to welcome you into the United Nations family, the family of nations. What a tremendous honor that day was to be recognized finally as the way our elders have always wanted it. So in closing, I just want to address one point that was raised earlier before lunch, because I think it's important. And that's the situation of provinces. Where are the provinces on this? And I've been advocating myself, every time I have a chance to meet with a premier, that they should take a leadership role, and as provinces, also support and endorse the declaration. I heard someone say it was a federal matter. Actually, it's all of us' matter. So. You know, the state of Maine in the United States adopted the UN Declaration before the US as a federal government did. Arizona, as a state, adopted the UN Declaration before the US did. As a matter of fact, it was a real honor. I was in the audience up in a gallery in the state legislature in Phoenix when the motion was going to be voted on for the Arizona of the US to vote on a declaration. And the speaker called me down to the floor of the chambers. So I went down to the floor of the chambers in Phoenix at the state legislature, and they voted on a declaration, and they adopted it, and they gave me a copy of the resolution. This is all happening before the US as a government did it. Northwest Territories adopted the declaration before Canada did. So British Columbia, what are you waiting for? Alberta, what are you waiting for? You know, they've been challenged, usually lobbied actually, to tell you the truth. They've been lobbied by the federal government not to endorse it. But I think now they've run out of excuses actually, run out of reasons as well, that there's really no reason anymore why they should not step forward and adopt it. So, First Nations governments, Indigenous governments, we need to do likewise. We can't just say to Alberta and Canada, yes, you should do it. There's one First Nation in Canada that has adopted it in their constitution. The ILO Convention, Convention on the Rights of the Child, and the UN Declaration are all in their constitution. Treaty assemblies now, when they have a resolution, it's always linked to an article, a relevant article of the Declaration. So we need to do our effort as well in implementing the Declaration. We have to stop saying also that the UN Declaration is non-legally binding. There's a 1962 legal opinion in the United Nations that says that it is more than a declaration, non-legally binding. Because in the recent child welfare case, which again, the province here, the leadership really was strong on, took the UN Declaration into account when they made their decision on a child welfare case. So I'm saying now that it has legal effect in Canada. So we shouldn't say anymore it's got no legal force. So the courts are starting to take it on board. We have to continue taking it on board, but also the provinces need to join us. And the municipalities, I'm really honored that there's some mayors and local leadership here, because that's something we can do together. Just like we can walk on a railway track holding each other up. Ohpin to win, our old people say, ohpin to win. That's where, working together, we will have a more inclusive, a more united, and a better Canada. Thank you. Hi, hi. Kinanaskant now. Thank you.
Thank you so much for inspiring us and showing us what's possible with perseverance and wisdom and the vision and following it through, and really showing us that portrait of the grand unfoldment of this ultimate challenge of our times, of the unfoldment of history towards recognition, respect, and justice. And I ask Chief White and President Nielsen to please present.
Thank you. I'm really overwhelmed by the gesture of you taking the time to come out to share the words that you have with the people here assembled, the leadership that you've shown, not just the Indigenous peoples of the world, but in fact, the peoples of the world, about how to live in a better way together is something that has had a profound effect on global society. And so it's with the deepest of gratitude that on behalf of Vancouver Island University and the Nanaimo First Nation, everyone that's gathered here, that we present you with this small gesture of our thanks to you for your time and for your leadership. Haichkasiam, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wilton.
Beautiful. Wonderful.
If we could all just stay seated, I believe someone has a plane to catch. And we could just stay seated and again thank Chief Littlechild for his. Thank you. This way, please.